Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Zara.
I'm Billi.
We are well and truly getting close to election season, with the next federal election to be held before May 17 this year. Over the past few days, there's been a suite of new polling released, with all three polls pointing to a possible Labor loss. In today's podcast, we're going to explain the latest on the election and what the new polling could tell us about Australia's next government.
All right, Zara, so before we get into the polling, I first want to look at when the election actually is, because
the golden question.
We are starting to hear more and more in the news cycle about the election. So for those who are a bit confused about when this election is, what can you tell us?
Yeah, so the problem is that at the moment we're in a bit of no man's land. So the thing is that it's very clear there is an election coming. Both sides.
Well, there has to be.
There has to be. Well, you've gotten to my point before I could get there. But there both has to be, and it feels like we're in an unofficial election season. So as a quick refresher, now that Billy's ruined this podcast, Australian election dates aren't set at regular intervals. So when it comes to the US, you know every time when there's going to be an election. In Australia, it's actually the Prime Minister's job to call an election. Now, this is done by him or her visiting the Governor-General, which is the King's representative, and the Governor-General then issues writs, which is when the election becomes official. There are parameters, though, that the Prime Minister needs to operate in. So the Constitution and the Australian Electoral Act both specify the last possible date for an election. So for this election cycle, the election can be held no later than the 17th of May, and that's almost exactly 3 years after the last election. The other small things that have to happen is that it has to be held on a Saturday and that there has to be 33 days between calling an election and the election actually being held. Lots of mathematics there, all to say it has to happen before the 17th of May. And it could actually happen as soon as this week. You know, the Prime Minister could on Sunday call an election, which would mean in 33 days' time there would be an election. But there is a bit for him to juggle in this scenario. There's a WA state election, there's some expected interest rate cuts, there's school holidays, and there's a budget. So the Prime Minister needs to basically work all around that and figure out the best timing for when an election should happen in, you know, cynically or just realistically to help Labor's chance of winning.
A very big call for him to make. So we know that it 100% needs to happen before May 17.
Yeah.
But which Saturday before then is still unknown. Yeah. We're hoping it won't be April 12th so that I can allegedly run my half marathon.
I was going to say, not for any official reason, but Billy is meant to be running a marathon. So Prime Minister, if you're Prime Minister, if you're listening, please not that day.
Okay. But that hasn't stopped both parties from starting their unofficial election campaigns.
Correct. Yeah.
What can you tell us about what they're starting to tell us about what they would do if either were elected?
Yeah, so as soon as the summer holidays, I guess, were over, both Labor and the Coalition were in full electioneering mode, even though, as we said, no election has been called yet. So last week was a sitting week, which is when both houses of Parliament are basically in session, and that gives the government a chance to introduce and pass legislation, and that's what the Labor government did. They used this as an opportunity to really push through some of their landmark legislation. So we saw, for example, this childcare subsidy that the government had announced a little while ago actually passed through Parliament, and it'll come into effect next year. And the government were also able to pass electoral donation reforms, which they had like on the back burner for a really, really long time, but managed to pass through in that last sitting week. On the other hand, the opposition spent the last week also talking about some of the big issues that they'll be taking into the election. There was a lot about anti-Semitism. There was a lot about breaking up insurance companies. That's continued into this week. I heard the opposition leader talking about it yesterday. And also more again about the economy, about household recession and, you know, prices of groceries and things like that. So those are kind of the two big things that the government and opposition have been focusing on.
Okay, so on the policy front, both major parties are really gearing up.
Yeah.
But the reason we're talking about it today is because over the weekend there was new polling that came out.
There was.
So what can you tell us about that?
Well, I'll give you a long and a short answer. Mm-hmm. So short answer is that the polling doesn't look good for Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. But the long answer is a bit more nuanced than that. And the long answer is that it doesn't look good for Anthony Albanese, but equally it doesn't look like Peter Dutton and the coalition could reach a majority if the election were called today. Now, there's a polling company called YouGov, and they published this seat-by-seat breakdown, and that was kind of the big centerpiece that was released over the weekend. And what we found out is that poll shows the coalition is on track to win approximately 73 seats at the next election, up from its current tally of 55. Meanwhile, that same poll showed that Labor could win around 66 seats, and that's down from 78 seats. So therefore, if these figures were to be replicated on polling day, so on the day of the election, if all of this polling was to be 100% accurate and that was what was going to unfold, Coalition leader Peter Dutton would be in a stronger position than Anthony Albanese to form a minority government, which would mean a hung parliament. So alongside this YouGov polling, there was also a news poll that was published yesterday that also put the Liberal Party ahead on a two-party preferred basis, with the Libs polling at around 51% and Labor at around 49%. Just to give you some context as to the peaks and troughs of where we've been and I guess where we're going. In September of 2022, at its peak, Labor was polling at around 57%, which is almost 10 points higher than they were in the poll published yesterday.
So you can pretty safely say that their popularity, the Labor Party's popularity, has seen a decrease. Because
absolutely.
A 10%.
It's unambiguous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and just before you mentioned hung parliament, do you want to just explain what actually that is? Because it's been a while since we've had one in Australia.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's going to be spoken about and mentioned a lot through this election campaign, especially if this polling maintains. So at this election, there's going to be 150 seats up for grabs in the House of Representatives. That's one less seat than the last election because there's been a bit of a redistribution there. But that's not what we're focusing on today. So if there's 150 seats up for grabs, in order to win majority government, a party needs to win 76 seats. That's the golden number they need to get to. If they don't get to that number, that's when you see minority government or a hung parliament. And that's when one of the major parties needs to negotiate to form that minority government by winning enough support from either the independents, so those teals that we've seen in the past, or minor parties like the Greens or Centre Alliance to basically make up the gap to that magic 76. It doesn't mean that, for example, the Teals and the coalition would formally join forces. There wouldn't be a new party name for the three of them or anything like that. It would just mean that they would agree to guarantee confidence and supply. That just means that they would keep the government in power and they'd vote to pass the budget so that money could be allocated. Essentially, they would just be ensuring that the government could do its job, but not necessarily voting with them on every policy at all. In exchange for the support, hypothetically, if this were to happen, minor parties and independents could impose some conditions. So they'd want support for certain policies or certain ideas that they pushed in Parliament. And so the reason, as I mentioned before, that we're talking about this today is because that YouGov poll that I mentioned before puts a hung parliament at a 78% probability. That's extremely high.
That is very high.
Next to that, it puts a coalition majority at about 19% probability and a Labor majority at 3%. So, yeah. Based on those numbers, we could be looking most likely at a hung parliament in the next session of Parliament.
And when was the last time Australia went to an election and did elect a minority government? I think it was when Julia Gillard was Prime Minister.
Gillard, correct. And she had to form minority government with the Greens and with certain independents who were in Parliament at that time.
But this isn't a certain outcome. It's just what the polling is suggesting.
Yes. And Harry in our office likes to remind us on an almost daily basis that polls cannot predict the outcome of an election, as he likes to say. Instead, they just capture a snapshot of the voters' mood. If anyone in this office is listening, they will be familiar with that. And it is worth touching on because the polls were famously wrong in 2019 when they predicted Labor would win the election. Yes.
Sorry, I just put my hand up to talk because my favourite fun fact is that Sportsbet paid out the election results 2 days early thinking that Labor would win based on the polls. And then
they were wrong.
And they were wrong.
Yeah.
And it meant that everyone who predicted Labor got their money, but then also everyone who predicted the coalition also got their money.
Yeah, it was crazy. I did look at Sportsbet the other day. It also does have the coalition ahead for this election. But again, I think just saying that is to say that polls can be wrong. It's been wrong in the US a number of times. It's been wrong in a number of jurisdictions. But here in Australia, the last time around, they were pretty much on the nose. So it'll be interesting to see how they perform this time.
And does the polling tell us what the biggest issues are that Australians will be voting on this election?
Well, we did have someone in the team speak to Paul Smith from YouGov, and he said that the main voting issues centre around the cost of living crisis, specifically when it comes to housing, grocery prices and wages, which I don't think will surprise anyone. We've heard this time and time again. He said specifically about the government, people are not angry at the government, but they're just disappointed and that they're looking for big economic change. He said whether it's about their wages, being able to afford a house, being able to go to a doctor that bulk bills, they want to see those big changes. And so just hearing that and knowing what we do about the electorate, it is very clear that this election is shaping up to be one that will be fought and potentially lost on matters pertaining to the economy.
And it's a particularly pertinent time to be talking about the economy because today the Reserve Bank of Australia is making its latest decision on the cash rate, which we commonly refer to them making a decision about interest rates because it directly impacts people who are borrowing money from banks. It's widely expected that they will cut interest rates, but we will have to wait and see.
And if they do, it'll be the first time in 4 years.
Yeah, crazy. So at 2:30 p.m. today, we are expecting news on that.
Yep.
And that will no doubt play into campaigns on both sides as it unfolds.
Yeah.
So we'll be keeping a close eye on that and we'll keep you updated on what the result is in this afternoon's headlines. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Daily Aus. If you like what you hear and you want to help The Daily Aus grow, if you could click follow on Spotify or Apple, it really helps us climb up those charts and helps new people find us. And as always, if you are feeling extra generous, if you can leave us a comment on Apple, it also really helps. Thank you so much, and we'll be back in your ears this afternoon with your headlines.